I'm reading Tom Holland's new book right now, not the guy who plays Spider-Man, the Oxford scholar, the intellectual historian. His new book is called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And of course, Tom Holland has written a few other books on the Greco-Roman tradition, Greco-Roman intellectualism, and the entire culture, and how those two things fit together. And he said it was once he started investigating the crucifixion that he actually realized that many of the things that he thought were commonplace in Western culture were not at all from the Greco-Roman world, but instead they were from some other place. And here's what he says, quote, "Assumptions that I had grown up with about how a society should be properly organized and the principles that it should uphold, they were not bred of classical antiquity," talking about the Greco-Roman culture here, "still less of human nature, but very distinctly of that civilization's Christian past." And as I've been reading this book, it's a brilliant book. However, you can almost in every instance swap out the word Christian for Hebraic, because that's what he actually means when he says Christian, is the goods that come to us through the Hebrew Bible and work their way through the Hebraic tradition, including Christianity. But this is not a new revelation. Back in the mid-20th century, you have Henri Frankfurt, who is a famous University of Chicago, what they called an Orientalist, somebody who studied the ancient Near East. And he says, in his book called The Intellectual Adventures of Ancient Man, he says in his chapter, quote, "The boundary between the ancient world and the modern world is to be traced not in the Aegean or the Middle Mediterranean," and here he's talking about Greece and Rome, "but in the pages of the Old Testament, where we find revealed Israel's attainments in the realms of thought, her facility in literary expression, her profound religious insights, and her standards of individual and social ethics." And so he then goes on to conclude, quote, "Israel was without peer in the power and the scope of their critical intellectualism." So part of the role of the Center for Hebraic Thought is to explore what are these, none of these people are Christians. They're actually people looking back on these literary traditions, making these astounding claims. The West and the way we think of the Western world actually doesn't have as much to do with Greco-Roman thought as these biblical claims, and I would say Hebrew Bible claims. So the Center for Hebraic Thought, our goal is to elevate the biblical thought world in both the church and the academy, and we're very fortunate to have fellows from the Center for Hebraic Thought, including Dr. Shira Weiss, who's sitting over here. We'll hear from her in a little bit, and Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman. So let me introduce him to you. Some of you have seen his video or videos. Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman is a professor of Hebrew Bible at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He's a graduate from right across the river here at Princeton University, and has his rabbinical ordination from the Israeli chief rabbinate. He is the author of several books, including Created Equal, How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought, which he'll be talking about today. One of my favorite books is Inconsistency in the Torah, the Ancient Literary Convention and its Limits of Source Criticism. And he has a brand new book, which I didn't write down the title, but he can tell us the title of that in a second, that came out today, to help Jewish readers and thinkers and Christians also think about what's going on in biblical scholarship and how do we process that. In addition to his scholarly output, Dr. Berman has also published pieces about the Hebrew Bible and contemporary thought in Mosaic Magazine and the Wall Street Journal, among other places. So please warmly welcome him.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Johnson, thank you for that introduction. Friends, I want to say really what a pleasure it is to be here this morning and to look out on a group of young faces who without knowing you personally, I assume that we are involved together in the same aspiration, and that is of how to lead a life of devotion, of high commitment to Scripture, and at the same time be very much part of a world where those assumptions are not necessarily shared by everyone around us, and that creates certain dilemmas, certain tensions for all of us. And what I want to speak about this morning is a way of looking at our Bibles that might be a little bit differently than how we normally think of them. We normally think of our Bibles as a source of spiritual inspiration. How will I relate to the Almighty? What does the Bible have to tell me about my own personal aspirations, my personal inclinations? And all of that is true and very important, but there is an aspect of the Bible that this center, the Center for Hebraic Thought, is devoted to, which I think is as I'm going to try to show, very deeply a part of the Bible and very deeply also about what we should be looking for in the Bible. And that is what the Bible has to tell us about politics. And when I say politics, I don't mean Trump or Sanders or anything like that, or pro-abortion or anti-abortion. I'm not talking about policies. What I am talking about is the fact that part of our life as human beings is how we live in community with one another. How will we grant power? To who do we grant power? What are the right ways in which power should be exercised? And this here, the Bible has tremendous things to say that is, in terms of a political document, I will claim that there has never been, in the history of political thought, one document that revolutionized so many areas of political thought all at once as the Hebrew Bible. So let's get started and let me try to show what I'm talking about here. I want us to all think of what the political landscape looked like in ancient times. And the best way to do this is from a story that I suspect many of us are familiar with. You might think of the Joseph story in the book of Genesis. And think of the snapshot you get of society in that story where Joseph is in Egypt, where you have at the top of the pyramid, pun intended, the Pharaoh. And then you have beneath that a kind of a landed gentry. That's Potiphar, that's Joseph's master, the guy who bought him. And then way down you have slaves. And the picture that seems to come out about society, and it's true the world over, is that whatever station in life you were born at, that is where you would spend the rest of your life. If you were born royalty, you stayed royalty. And if you were born rich, landed gentry, that's where you would stay. And if you were born a slave, that is where you would stay. There was no notion of moving up or down. The fact that Joseph moves up is only because he has the Almighty on his side. But that aside, wherever you were born is where you would wind up. There was no notion at all of equality or of social mobility. And this was true in Egypt, and it was true in Rome and in Greece. Even Greece, we think of Greece as the cradle of democracy. Sure, for the top 10%. And then you had all this hierarchy and stratification underneath it. And we might think for a moment, now why is that? Because for us as moderns, for us as Americans, the idea that all men are created equal, the idea that each and every one of us can strive to rise higher and higher on the social ladder, on the economic ladder, is so central to our being that it's kind of shocking to think that this is a new idea. Why didn't ancients think in these terms anywhere in the world? And the answer is that it's not just that it was an idea they hadn't thought about. Had you proposed this idea in the ancient world anywhere, they would have looked at you like you are crazy, because what they understood was that in order for society to function properly, everyone must know their calling. They must know what box they fit in. And what you're born into, that'll be the box you fit in. And in this way, everything will be able to work together. That's what's called harmony. And so this idea that, you can decide what you want to be, and you can move up, and people will move down, they would have viewed as a recipe for anarchy. The Hebrew Bible, particularly the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, is the first blueprint that we have in the history of the world that takes a swing and a crack at this conception of society as being strictly hierarchical and stratified. What I want to try to show you this morning, friends, is how the Hebrew Bible looks to draw power away from where power had been located, either politically and economically, and it seeks for the first time to put the common person at the center and to give them power. And we're going to try to see this primarily in how the Torah views political office and in how it views its economic policies. So let's start with political office. The Torah describes, it says that Israel shall have a king. Every country, every nation in the ancient world had a king. But what the Torah says about the Israelite king is worlds different than what we know about kingship anywhere else. This is, if you want to look this up later in your Bibles, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 17. There's about 8 verses dedicated to this. And what's interesting is that you might expect that the Torah would lay out, well, the king has the right to tax, to draft people into an army. The king ought to go and build temples. He ought to lead the country out to war. There's none of that. The only thing that the Torah tells us about the king is what he can't do, limitations on him. He cannot have too many wives. He cannot have too large a treasury. He cannot have too many horses, which is to say, a large and powerful army. This idea that the most powerful person in the polity has limits on him that are dictated, that are written down, that are known by all, existed nowhere else in the world. Elsewhere in the world, Hammurabi maybe is a figure you've heard of. Kings were the ones that wrote the laws to be imposed upon the people. In the Torah, the king is subject to the laws just like the rest of Israel are. And all of these laws seek to limit the scope of his kingship. No big harem, no great treasury, no big army. But what's maybe even more remarkable about what the Torah says about kingship is best illustrated from something else. Let's leave aside the Torah for a second. I want you all to think about what you know about the British Parliament. Now, if you say to me, but Professor Berman, I know nothing about the British Parliament. But all of you know that in the British Parliament there are two houses, just like our Congress has two houses, but they don't use the same names as we have here. In the British Parliament, there is a House of Lords, excellent, and a House of Excellent, good, okay. Think about that. Lords and Commons, that is not quite the same as a Senate and a House of Representatives. Why did they have a House of Lords and a House of Commoners, of Commons? This is how this idea got off the ground. And you'll see, I'll explain why this is so important for understanding a whole bunch of things. When they were setting up the British Parliament, they thought, the way our society is designed is that we have these class distinctions. We have lords and we have common folk. And if we give all the power to the lords, then they're just going to enslave the common folk. And if we give all the power to the common folk, then they're just going to go despoil the lords and steal all the money and shut down the manners that the lords had. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we have these pre-existing divisions in our society, lords and commons, and we want to have kind of a bulwark against the monarchy. So we're going to give a little bit of power to the lords and a little bit to the commoners, and they'll balance each other out. Now, why do I raise this? I raise this because what you see from this is that in order to be in the House of Lords, you had to be a lord. And if you wanted to be in the House of Commons, then you had to be a commoner. In other words, the way in which the British, or the English at the time, looked at political power, it wasn't that any citizen can run for any office. No, political power is always ascribed to a pre-existing division within the society. Commoners go here, lords go here, kings and queens, House of Windsor, they go there. I bring that as an example because this is the way in which political power was divvied up and made available everywhere throughout history, in Greece and in Rome. There was never any idea that is so obvious and intuitive to us that, well, there's a political position and anybody can run for it. You just got to be a citizen. That idea never existed anywhere, really until the American founding, and even there, only for certain political offices. The only precedent that we have to what we have in this country, right, so this is less than 300 years old, that there will be political office and it is not immediately given out to a particular family or to a particular class within a society. The only precedent for that in the history of political thought is Deuteronomy 17, which says, "From amongst your brethren you shall choose a king." That is to say, anyone within ancient Israel theoretically could have been the king. And it is the people that choose the king. This is also something that never existed anywhere else and only comes up much, much later. There's an idea about judges in ancient Israel. Who should appoint judges? This is an interesting question. Who appoints our judges? This is handled differently in different countries. In some places, judges appoint judges. In some places, presidents appoint judges, right? In the Supreme Court, as you know, that's how it works. Well, there was a thinker called Montesquieu in the 16th century, and he said, really, who needs to choose the judges? The people need to choose the judges. The people need to choose the judges because judges have the capacity to really dip into your pocket or take you and throw you into jail. And so if people are to have faith in their judges, they have to be the ones that are choosing them so that the judges are accountable to them. This was a remarkably new idea in the 16th century, and the only place in the history of political thought that this idea exists before that is in Deuteronomy chapter 16, where it says, "You shall choose judges for yourselves." And so we see here several ideas about political power that are revolutionary. They were revolutionary back then, and it took a really, really long time for modern political theorists to come around to these ideas. I want to talk about economic policy and how the Torah has a very coherent economic plan that I think even has great implications for today as well. Now, even those of you that might be quite familiar with the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, might think, he talked about the Joseph story. I remember that one. I remember reading that. And he talked about Deuteronomy 17, the laws of the king. I remember reading that. Where is this economic plan that the Torah has? What book and chapter and verse was that? So here, I want to give a little bit of a background of what the economy looked like in the ancient world, and then I'll begin to show you how there's a very carefully calibrated and orchestrated economic plan that the Torah gives to empower and to provide a safety net for the common person in Israel. Economic times in the ancient world were different than they were today. Things could be much worse, fluctuations much worse than we have today. Think back again to the story of Joseph. Do you recall there's 7 years of famine in Egypt? And do you recall what happens in those 7 years of famine? The Egyptians need food. And when you need food, what do? You start to sell off everything. First you sell off, maybe you have some jewelry that you sell off, and then once that's gone and you've eaten whatever you were able to buy from that, then you move on to selling your donkey and your cow and your plot of land. That's really bad because then there's no way to get back up on your feet economically. And then once you've sold all of those assets that used to help you make money, then what you sell is yourself and your daughter and your son, and you go into servitude, and there's no way out. It is a bottomless pit. This is what the Torah describes in Genesis 47 and 48. This is what happened to the Egyptians. 7 years of famine. They sold and sold and sold everything they had. The common people, the masses, sank down to the bottom, and the money floated all the way to the top. This is what would happen the world over, from India to Greece and every place in the middle. This is a very well-known economic phenomenon. That when times are good, then this simple guy, he goes out to his little field each day, he grows some tomatoes, he comes home, he sells them, he puts dinner on the table. But there's no insurance like we have today. There's no unemployment insurance. There's no savings plans. You can't even freeze stuff in the freezer. People really lived hand to mouth from what they produced each day. And so when times got tough means there could be a drought, there could be a famine, there could be a plague, there could be a war. This scene that I've painted for you of what happens in Genesis 47, 48 is immediately what would take over. That people would sink to the bottom and all their money would sink to the top, to the hands of a few mighty and rich people. Now, this was dealt with in different ways the world over. I'll get to in a second. But now what I want to show for you is how the Torah is aware of this type of issue which plagued every ancient economy, and how the Torah steps in and says, we want to make a series of breaks, of safety stops, that will help the simple person from sinking to the bottom when mass economic ruin sets in order to retain his financial security and therefore also his dignity. The first and most important plank in the Torah's economic policy is its jobs program. What chapter and verse is the jobs program? Well, it might be something you're familiar with, but probably no one ever called it a jobs program. As you might know, The Torah says that the land of Israel is to be parceled out to the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? Jacob had 12 sons. Each son becomes the head of a tribe of Israel. And then in each tribe got a tribal ancestry area in the land of Israel. And then within each tribal region, it was further divvied up to the clans and to the families and the subfamilies, such that every family wound up having ownership of a small plot of land. Now, most people who might even be familiar with that would say, well, the reason that was done was that the land of Israel is an inheritance. And if any of you, well, you're young, I suspect few of you have collected an inheritance, but if your parents have collected an inheritance, then my grandparents maybe passed away, and there's my parents, but they have brothers and sisters, and so, we each got a small part, and then me and my brothers and sisters will get a smaller part if there's anything left, and it gets smaller and smaller as time goes on. So the land of Israel is an inheritance. This is true. This is part of the dynamic that's at work here. But there's also an economic philosophy at work here, and that is that the Torah says we're going to take the very land itself and give it to the people. Every family will have, because when you give people a plot of land, you're giving them a source of income. This never happened anywhere in the world. The land was owned by the temple or by the palace, by the king. There is no precedent in world history of a country taking large tracts of its land and just giving it out. The next time that we see this, friends, is in 1862 or 3 with the Homestead Act in this country. Some of you might be familiar with this, that as the U.S. expanded westward, there were these vast tracts of land that were open because there was genocide of the Indians, but we won't talk about that right now. Well, once the Indians weren't there, then all this land was available. And the government didn't take it for itself. The government said, you move out west, and you plop down on a plot of land, and if you stay there through the harsh winters for a few years, it'll be yours. And I have friends, maybe some of you do too, out in the Midwest, whose families still live on these plots of land that they got from the government in 1862. But this idea that the land will go to the common people to be a source of income for them is a remarkable idea. It starts in the Bible, and it starts with this divvying up of the land of Israel. What are some of the things that used to make people impoverished, that would sink them down when times were difficult? Well, one was taxation. Taxation was very, very heavy in the ancient world. And if you were poor, you paid taxes. It wasn't like here, if you're better off, then you'll pay a higher level of income tax. And if you're really not well off at all, you won't pay any income tax. No, back then, tax was everywhere. But in the Bible, there's no official taxes that are given out. The king can never say, it says here in the Bible, chapter and verse, that you have to pay tax to me. There's an ancient law code called the Laws of Hammurabi. Maybe you've heard of this. It's kind of a famous sort of thing. There it says that when someone takes a loan, that the interest on it will be 33% per annum. That's huge. Very good if you're giving the loan. Not so good if you're taking the loan. And in the Bible, you're supposed to lend to your fellow brother money interest-free, because it's supposed to help you get it back up on your feet. Maybe the most remarkable thing that we have in the Bible about how the Bible viewed the economy, this blows me away every time I get to talk about this, has to do with the calendar. The calendar. Let me explain. The Bible didn't invent a calendar. Every culture, every society has a calendar. But when you look in ancient times, you will see that the calendars are not quite the same as ours. You will see that in Egypt and Mesopotamia, all throughout the ancient Near East, calendars measured 3 units of time: years, months, and days. What's missing? Weeks, yeah. Can anyone think why the ancients might have measured years, months, and days, not weeks? I mean, it's terrible. If you don't have a week, you don't have a weekend. Why is that? Well, what do those other 3 have in common? Years, months, days? Yeah?
Have lunar and solar markers.
Okay, right. years and months and days are measured by astronomical events, right? The moon, obviously, we know, the moon waxes and it wanes, 30 days, something like that. Days, obviously, right? The sun rises every day. And even years are measured the same way. The sun kind of comes back to the same place relative to a given point on an annual basis. So I know, for example, when I go to my synagogue on Saturday mornings for Sabbath prayers, I know every year that from the 12th of May until the 5th of August, I have to come to Sabbath morning services with sunglasses on, looking like a movie star. Because this huge window, the sun is like right in my face. And I will tell you that I think that the ancients knew that the sun does this even without going to synagogue. Okay? Everyone knew this, that the sun comes back to where it is. So they were able to measure these astronomical events, and that helped them make their calendars, years, months, and days. Weeks, what is a week? Astronomically, a week is nothing. Years don't divide by 7. Months don't divide by 7. So that a week is an entirely artificial construct in terms of, when we measure lunar and solar events. Well, a week obviously comes from our Bible, right? And it obviously comes from the 6 days of creation and that God rested on the 7th. But I want to talk about what the Torah was trying to achieve by imposing this 7th day of rest. In the Torah, it isn't merely that we have 6 days of work and then a 7th day of rest. In the Torah, there's also a sabbatical cycle, 6 years of agricultural work, and in the 7th year, the land is meant to lie fallow so that nobody is working the land. And then after 7 sabbatical cycles, 49 years, the 50th year is also a kind of a stop that happens. Now, why is this important? What does this give us? Well, it gives us rest. Rest is good. And obviously, it's only because of the Bible's depiction of 6 days of work and the 7th day of rest that we get the Sabbath, which leads us to the weekend. Everybody likes weekends. So rest is a good thing, but it isn't only about rest. It's about something that's maybe no less fundamental and so important in our time. When the Torah says on the 7th day everybody rests, when the Torah says that in the 7th year nobody goes out to work the field, essentially what it is saying is that for the first 6 days, or for the first 6 years in the sabbatical cycle, what we spend most of our time doing is investing in ourselves as economic beings. We go out and we work. It's not an accident. You meet somebody, probably the first question you ask them once you graduate is, what do you do? And what do you do is not, oh, I knit or I play lacrosse. What do you do? People are asking, what do you do for a living? What is your economic identity? This is so much a part of our culture. And the truth is that the answer to that, what do you do, which is another way of saying, how successful are you? The truth is that this game of making money, some of us are really, really good at that. And some of us are academics. This is the way of the world, okay? And it means that very quickly, since we spend so much time in economic productivity, some of us get really good and some of us less good. And it creates a kind of unhealthy dynamic in society. Even if we're good capitalists and we recognize that this is probably the way it has to be, it creates something where we're all bowing down to those that really get a lot of money, and those of us that don't kind of feel kind of lousy about ourselves to some degree or another if we're not making quite enough. What the Torah says is that on the 7th day, or in the 7th year, nobody's making any money. And therefore we have to each encounter one another on a different axis as human beings. This 7th day, this 7th year, in the Israelite conception of it, is a day that's dedicated to the Lord. It's not an accident. It's called the Lord's Day. It's a day in which we ask, well, what do you do as a servant of the Lord? What do you do for your community? What do you do for your spirit? And so this is a day of rest, but it is also a day of enormous redemption for each of us, because it forces us to encounter one another on a different axis, on an axis of the spirit and not on the axis of economic production, for all of the importance that there is in that. I remember during the economic crisis in 2008, many of you were still quite little. But you know that there was such a thing. Maybe even you remember it to some degree. And I remember I came out of Kennedy Airport and I saw a big billboard, and it said Financial Crisis 101. Self-worth is worth more than net worth. And I'm driving and I'm like, oh, that's pretty good. I almost hit the guy in front of me. And I suspect that all the cars, you know, yeah, good, yeah. But you know, that's easily said, easily written on a billboard, much harder to put into practice in the hyper-competitive culture in which we live. This is why our commitment to our spiritual selves, beyond what we do for the Almighty, what we do for ourselves by this is so important, so important. And so this, I think, is the most important plank of the Torah's economic platform. That it says, yes, we're not going to be naive and idealistic and say that we're going to be pure socialists and just give out and, you know, help the needy as much as we can and everybody should have more or less the same thing. That doesn't work out. It's proven itself historically. But we are going to say that if we are going to be a competitive capitalist society, and that's going to therefore bring us to our fullest potential because we have incentive, and this will create greater wealth for everybody, that does need to be tempered and leavened by certain stops in our calendar that's patterned after the Almighty's rest himself. Those times at which we say we are stopping our economic activity and seeking one another on an axis of the Spirit. And so what I've tried to show here, friends, are ways in which the Torah takes political power and it took economic power, where inevitably the rich would always get richer because at some point or another there would be a famine or a plague or a war. And the Torah seeks to take power away from the kings, take the money away from the extremely wealthy, and to put it back in the hands of the common people. I'll just give one more example of this. I mentioned before that all the world over, you would have stories like what we see in Genesis 47-48, the famine in Egypt, where the money rises to the top and the people sink to the bottom. All the world over, the way in which kings dealt with this was when a new king would come into power, he would declare a cancellation of debt. This would do two things. It would immediately give the people a bit of a respite, and they would all applaud what a wonderful king this is, and it would weaken his rivals, because when people have too much money, they become a bit of a threat to the king. And so this is actually the origin of the word amnesty in Greek. When a king would cancel debt, that was called amnesty. What we see in the Torah is a kind of a tweaking of this idea. Because if what happened everywhere else was that a king would do this in the first year of his kingship, then essentially it served the king. And it also meant that if you were a peasant who was deep in debt, you didn't know, when is there going to be a new king? Who knows? You can't plan. The Torah says we're going to have debt cancellation. It's not clear if it was ever put into action, but what's important for me here is to see how the Torah tweaks this ancient granting of amnesty, of debt cancellation. What the Torah says in Deuteronomy 15 is, or 16, 15, is that in every seventh year, in the sabbatical year, the debts will be canceled automatically. Meaning it's not a political football for the help of the king. It's something that if you're down and out, you can measure. 6 years is a long time, but not too long. You can see how much longer you have until you can get back up on your feet. And there are many, many more examples of this. I see that they have my book there, Created Equal, How the Torah Broke with Ancient Political Thought. I say that not as a sales pitch for it, but those that might, in honesty and earnesty, wish to pursue the topic further. But this is what I meant, friends, about engaging our Bibles. Yes, it's about our relationship with the Almighty. It's about understanding myself, the complexity of who I am as a human being. But it's not just about me, I. It's about us. It's about how we organize ourselves. It's about how we view power. It's about how we can read the Bible politically. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berman. That was a treat. There is a lot more where that comes from. This book is fantastic, by the way. It's actually one of the reasons that we asked him to be a fellow for the Center for Hebraic Thought is because notice how much he just knew about the Torah, and he's able to instantly move this over. What are the notions that are being supplied and reinforced and repeated in context? What structures are being torn down? And this has direct relevance for how we think about ourselves today. How even America has been structured. Sometimes maybe needs to be restructured in light of some of these things. Okay, so we have 3 esteemed guests. We had 4, but he's dead to me now. Dr. Tubbs, our politics professor, Dr. Griffin, our politics professor, and Shira Weiss, who is also a fellow. She's a philosopher. And I'm going to give Shira, you can take the first chair. And you guys, we have enough chairs for all of us. Perfect. Thank you, Zach. And we're going to have to share microphones. So they've all at least been able to skim read, like you guys do, Created Equal, this book. And so they've come with some questions for Dr. Berman. So do you want to take them one at a time, or you want to hear them all out and kind of decide?
I think I don't want to decide.
Okay, so we'll take them one at a time, beginning with Dr. Weiss.
We'll do 2 rounds of questions?
Yeah, we'll do 2 rounds.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, both for your talk and for the book. You distinguished in your talk today, and also in the majority, or at least the first few chapters of the book, between the Bible's laws, both of an economic and political nature, and those of other ancient Near Eastern legal codes. But I'd like to turn our attention to the final chapter of your book about narrative. You demonstrated the parallel between the Exodus story of the rescue of Moses and also the Sargon legend. And a couple of questions related to that. Number 1, how common are such parallels? Number 2, what's the nature of the influence? And number 3, related to the bulk of your book and your talk today, can you extract any differences common to the biblical narratives, which are distinct from ancient Near Eastern literature, as you did with biblical law?
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. Let me just maybe give a little more context to Dr. Weiss's question. We might be familiar with the story in Exodus 2 of the saving of baby Moses by the daughter of Pharaoh, right? She takes the basket and saves the baby. And there's a very similar story. It's actually a story that appears in a lot of places in the ancient Near East. It's so eerily similar that one has to wonder, did the Torah perhaps copy what was out there? And this is a common thing that comes up with a bunch of very famous stories that we have in the Bible generally and in the Torah particular. Maybe most famously, the story of the flood of Noah. It turns out that there is a Mesopotamian version of this that's much older than the Torah that has basically the same storyline. And so, with different names, but almost very, very strikingly similar ideas. And so Dr. Weiss's question is, how do you explain this phenomenon generally? And I want to say a couple of things that I think are apropos to my talk. The Torah does take famous tropes, famous stories that are out there, and it adopts them within the Torah, but it always seeks to tweak them so that the message that comes out from the story is repackaged and in a far new and I would say revolutionary way. Let me give an example of this from the flood story. In the Mesopotamian flood story, what those inscriptions tell us is that the gods, why did the gods want to destroy mankind? Because men were making too much noise. They wanted to sleep in the afternoon, the gods, and there was too much noise from men. And so they were looking for a way to reduce human reproductivity. And so they wind up destroying the world and then regretting it because then they weren't getting the sacrifices that they wanted. And at the end of the Mesopotamian version, they come to a kind of a compromise. We will let man live, but we will institute all sorts of things that will limit human reproductivity. So we'll have some babies that are born as stillborns, and we'll have women that can't conceive, and we'll have other women that will make priestesses. And in this way, we will limit human reproductivity. Okay? Along comes the Torah and gives a very similar story. And at the end, when Noah leaves the ark, the first thing, virtually the only thing that he is told is, now that you are leaving the ark, Pru urevu umil'u et haaretz. Be fruitful and multiply. There is a ringing endorsement of the value of human life. And in the Torah, the reason that God is angry with people is not because his sleep is being disturbed, but because their moral fiber had sunk to the bottom. And so by taking very popular myths, very popular stories, and tweaking them, the Torah uses something that was very popular to bring out what were then very radically new ideas. Oh,
Yeah, you
oh, okay.
Thank you, Dr. Berman. Very stimulating talk. As Dr. Johnson mentioned, I teach politics here. I, from time to time, teach a course called Foundations of Politics. And one of the things that we try to do in this course is assess the ways in which Christianity influenced politics of the ancient world, meaning the Greek and Roman world.
Mm-hmm.
Now my gaps here relate to the Jewish world and contributions that come from the Hebrew scriptures that we as Christians might not recognize immediately. But I wanted to ask you one question about the title of your book and the notion of equality at play. Dr. Johnson mentioned a new book by the British classicist Tom Holland. There was a similar book published about 12 years ago by theologian David Bentley Hart, and it was called Atheist Delusions, the Christian Social Revolution and its Fashionable Detractors. And one thing that he said in the book, which I share with my students, I draw their attention to, is he said that when Rome was very close to embracing Christianity and finally became Christian, infanticide as a practice came to an end. And the Christians from the beginning insisted that this is just wrong because every human being, even human beings who are very feeble and sickly when they're born, are made in the image of God. And so your own notion of equality as it's presented in Hebrew scripture, do we know anything about the practice of the Jewish communities in the ancient Near East with respect to this particular issue? I could imagine the Jewish community stood apart from all the other communities, but I've never really read anything about this.
Okay. Knowing how ancient Israel really functioned is difficult. Let me explain what I mean by that. We have our Bibles, and our Bibles tell us Moses did this, and King David did this, and King Solomon did this. What's underneath the question is that modern scholars are sometimes skeptical. To what degree can we trust what the biblical sources are telling us? And so the question, as I understood it, is, do we know anything independent of our Bibles as to how ancient Israel really functioned, and to what degree these types of lofty ideals that I described from the Torah, to what degree were they actually implemented? And so I'll just share one fascinating archaeological finding. And that is from a colleague of mine at the university that I teach at, Bar-Ilan University. His name is Avram Faust. And he doesn't do Bible. He says, I want to look at what I dig up, what we dig up, and come to conclusions from that. And what he has noticed is that during the biblical period, particularly the First Temple period, let's say from the conquest of Israel in about 1200 BCE until the destruction of the First Temple in the 6th century BCE, he says, we dig up all sorts of sites over the land of Israel, cities, burial plots, and we're able to get some degree of insight into day-to-day living. And he says, we see two remarkable things about the Israelite dwellings from those periods. He says, everywhere else, all other cultures that you look at, you see that you can clearly identify the rich from the poor in two ways. In more elaborate homes, you find earthenware that is richly decorated with drawings or designs on them. And in poorer dwellings, you just find earthenware with no designs, no inscriptions on them. And the second thing is that in burial plots, you can see the rich have, sarcophaguses or plaques, or there's something that distinguishes a rich person's burial place from a poor person's burial place. And he says, within ancient Israel, when you dig up one of their cities, you can never tell which houses were rich and which were not. The pottery all looks the same. And when we find the burial caves where people were buried, you can never distinguish anything about class at all. And I think that that's just amazing, because it shows that the ideas that I tried to develop before really seem to come through in the very little remains that we have left for us. Okay? Yeah.
I will, for the sake of the students, I'll add on, there are a couple of good books I can point you to on Jews in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE and how they're distinguished. So one of the distinguishing marks in antiquity is going to be Jewish fathers celebrating their daughters on their tombstone, wherever there's a tomb placard. You don't have many Greek men or Roman men celebrating their daughter or fondly remembering their young women who have died. So there's some esteeming of women amongst the Jewish communities that it doesn't happen in Greco-Roman culture. Sean Flynn's book on children in ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible is great as well on this issue. I also want to say we're going to do one more round after Dr. Griffith speaks. We're going to do one more round of questions and then turn it over to you. So be thinking of questions, even if they're super basic, not like the basic, but like super basic questions, that, you know, clarifications. Be thinking of things that you want to ask Dr. Berman as well. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Berman, for a great talk and a great book. I enjoyed it a lot. I teach politics here at King's College. One of the things we try to emphasize to our students is the importance of the greatness of separating powers. The American Constitution separates powers into different branches of government. So I found your talk about comparing Hebraic thought with Montesquieu and Harrison quite stimulating and illuminating. I was wondering, why do you think we don't see more details about the form of government in the Torah? The Constitution specifies the age, the minimum age of the president or House of Representatives. The specific powers that they do have, and not only the powers that they don't have. Why do you think that the Torah doesn't specify in more detail those details?
Okay. Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I had mentioned earlier that the Torah prescribes, it limits kings in terms of the number of wives, the number of horses, the amount of treasure that a king can have. But there's really very little in terms of, you know, the types of things that we would find in our Constitution, that these are the different branches, this is how many judges you have, this is the term that a judge has, these are the rules, these are the things that a king is supposed to do. It's really kind of threadbare in those areas. And I think this is, you know, it's difficult to read from what isn't written. But I would say the following, that is that, you know, even to this very day, we do not know what the ideal form of government is. Oh, sure, the democracy, we're ready to say that, perhaps, some of us, most of the time. But even within that, should a leader have set term limits, like we have in our presidency, or not, as is the case in very many governments around the world, in very developed countries? How many branches of the legislature? And on and on. There are a lot of questions that even after we've been working at this as a modern society for a good 3-4 centuries, there's still a lot of questions that are open. And when we get to economic policy, we're even more in the dark as to how do we balance the need to care for people, but then to also urge people to be productive, the socialist safety net and the capitalist necessity for an economy to thrive. And I think that by not going into much greater detail, but kind of laying out in broad terms limits to a king, limits to some others, what the Torah is saying is there's no magic bullet. And it's going to be up to you in every generation to determine what is going to fit best. A lot of this really depends on technology, it turns out. As you may know, friends, we live in modern nation states, Canada, the US, Mexico, England. These are relatively modern inventions, the idea that you have a country that's really big. I mean, most nations really only come into existence in the 19th and 20th centuries. Before that, people lived in villages, or they lived in cantons, in much closer, smaller locales. And so there's all sorts of reasons why nation states began to develop in the 19th century. A lot of it has to do with technology and communication and transportation. And so what you can see is that the ideal as to how a society should structure itself is not the type of thing that can be imposed at one point in time, whether we're talking about 3,000 years ago, or whether we're talking about coming up with an ideal today, whatever we come up with today will be outdated tomorrow. And so I think the Torah wanted to give broad warnings about the abuse of power, and then exactly how you should structure yourself. Well, this is going to be up to you guys to figure out in each generation. That's the best that I can say on that. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a follow-up, more particular question on my more general question earlier. And that is, again, in the chapter on narrative, on page 151, you discuss inner speech, specifically in the context of Pharaoh's daughter. But you describe inner speech, known more formally as free indirect discourse, as a hallmark of biblical narrative, a literary innovation that allowed for the first time in ancient Near Eastern literature for such exploration of characters' inner cognitive processes that motivate their action. So I was wondering, why do you suppose that this was introduced in biblical literature as opposed to other ancient Near Eastern texts?
Okay, all right. Let me explain a little bit about what Dr. Weiss is referring to. Returning to the story of the rescue of baby Moses in the basket. It says in Exodus 2, verse 6, it gives an account of what happened when Pharaoh's daughter approached this basket. And it says, and she opened it, and she saw him, and behold, there was a baby crying, and she had pity on it. And she said, oh, this is from the Hebrew babies. Now, when it says, and behold, it was crying, that behold it's almost as if the cameraman is situated on her shoulder. You know, when we watch a movie or a TV show, the angle from which the action is filmed plays an enormous role in our perception. You know, think of like when you have a couple on a date in a bar, okay, and this is or in a restaurant, and this is being filmed. When she speaks, the camera is almost like on his shoulder. You're perceiving it as he perceives it. And when he speaks, the camera is on her shoulder, and you're perceiving it as she does. Well, the Torah also has a camera. And when it says, and behold, it was a baby crying, then the camera is right over her shoulder. It's not just telling us what happened. It's telling us what she's experiencing inside of her. And this is a type of narration, a way of telling a story, which comes to life for the first time in biblical storytelling that didn't exist elsewhere. And I think the reason for this is that much more than any other ancient religion, the Torah has an eye on human behavior. Elsewhere in the ancient world, what gods were really interested in was sacrifices and temples and feed me. And in the Torah, what God is primarily interested in is proper behavior and struggle sometimes to get what is the proper behavior in this circumstance. And we can all understand the enormous dilemma for Pharaoh's daughter. She is, after all, the Pharaoh's daughter. She's not even named, because what's really important is that she's Pharaoh's daughter. And we know what's incumbent upon her. She has to sink this basket. That's what she needs to do. But she's also a human being. And she's also a woman. And she has, therefore, pulls in those other directions. And so the Torah wants to play up that tension by describing in great detail the kind of enormous moral conflict that she experiences at that moment. Because what the Hebrew Bible is looking at is the complexity of human behavior and sometimes the difficult decisions that human agents have to make. Okay.
So I liked very much what you said about the Sabbath and how it's this day during the week when people are not on the economic axis. I like that formulation very much. And so my next question is largely meant to be for the benefit of the students here, because I've been teaching at King's since 2005. I teach constitutional law. A good number of my former students now practice law, and if they are in so-called big law in major American cities, usually I hear from them that they have colleagues, observant Jews, who observe the Sabbath and stop working on Friday afternoon to get ready for the Sabbath. And it's somewhat discouraging to me from time to time to hear from my former students that they're working on Sunday. They just seem to be a little too ready to work on Sunday. They're maybe telling themselves, well, if I want to advance in this law firm, I have to be. But a few lawyers, Christian lawyers, have come to the college and said, look, you can do what the observant Jewish colleagues are doing with respect to Sunday if, when you're interviewing, you let it be known that you don't want to work on Sunday. But this is the question. You emphasized primarily in talking about the Sabbath, the community as a whole. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the Sabbath, the non-economic access, and family life. Because when I think of Jewish friends and people I know, these lawyers, for example, it seems to be a very important part, not the whole of Sabbath observance, is time to spend with the family. And the thing that I find so attractive, and I think it relates to the theme of equality in your book, is that this is regarded as a good for all observant Jews. It doesn't matter their status. It's good for all observant Jews to be on the non-economic axis for that day, and regardless of maybe how humble their family circumstances are, to spend this time together. So could you talk a little bit about that dimension? Because I think it really, in the long run, is very important for observant Christians to affirm the importance of our Sabbath, and we can learn so many things from Jewish observance of the Sabbath.
Okay, let me just say a little bit about the Jewish Sabbath as it's dictated in Jewish law. Shira and I are both Orthodox Jews. We have a lot of laws, a lot of laws. We can't eat most of the good food that's available in Manhattan. And there's a lot of things we can't do. On the Sabbath, we can't do anything. We can't drive. We can't use our cell phones. We can't even use electronic appliances unless they are set on a timer, for example, or they've been turned on before the Sabbath. So we're really shut down. The upside of that is that it really allows you a space for interiority. I mean, some people I've heard say, wow, you mean a whole day, 24 hours without my phone? There's actually something kind of liberating about that. And so this automatically creates a lot of time to spend with neighbors. Yes, you actually know your neighbors' names, and you can do stuff with them, and family time especially. One of the really remarkable things in modern day Israel, not everybody in Israel is an observant Jew, maybe a quarter of the population. Many of them are fully secular, but the value of the Sabbath, of Shabbat, has trickled down, and on Friday night, almost way above 90% of Israeli Jews on a Friday night are sitting around the table with their families. That's a beautiful thing, and really, really stretched in our time when, you can be doing anything at any moment. And, any of you, I grew up having dinner with my family every night. Unfortunately, my wife and I have not been able to replicate that. I suspect that very few of you here have actually had dinner with the family every night. That's a special thing. And even to have it once a week is a special thing. And in this day and age when there's just so much out there and so many things demanding our time, especially this idea that on the Sabbath, the family comes together is really very much part of what goes on in modern Israel. Yeah.
When I think about the Hebraic Bible and quality, normally what comes to mind to me is Genesis, where it said that we are created in God's image.
Yeah. Man and woman together.
Man and woman together, created in God's
Yeah.
image. Yes. For mostly my own benefits, how do you interpret that phrase?
Oh, wow.
What political or social implications does that phrase have? Maybe this is a big question, but
Okay.
I'm curious.
Right. Okay. So in Genesis 1, of course, man and woman are created on the sixth day, and they're told to have dominion over the universe. And what the Bible is telling us there is that each of us has an element of godliness within us, and therefore that demands a certain degree of respect in how we treat one another. I think it's as simple as that. There are some other ideas that I develop in Created Equal that demonstrate that the Torah seems to view each individual as having some elements of kingship, as it would come through in ancient conventions and ways of dress, etc. But I think it's just really to elevate the standing of each and every person. For us as Americans, maybe that's a given. But in so many places in the world, it's really not. You just trample over the masses, and it just doesn't really matter, as long as the people in power, get their way. So when it comes home, it's really, I'd say, battered home, page after page in the Bible, about how each person has an element of kingliness to him, each person has divinity within them. Well, this demands a certain degree of respect for human life and for how we relate to one another. I think it's carried out certainly in the New Testament as well. Yeah.
I think that's what's really important about what you said is that if you stop at Genesis 1, just the image of God, so them and male and female. I've been telling some students in office hours this week, the people who came to the Americas and looked at the indigenous people here, and they had to have this question of, well, are they human or not?
Right.
And pastors fought for them, saying, no, they're made in the image of God. If they're humanoid, they must, well, wait. Gets bad. And so their decision was, because they're made in the image of God, we can enslave them. We can't treat them like beasts of burden. We can't work them into their death. We actually have to put shackles on them and make them into slaves.
Wow.
So if you stop at image of God, you don't get it as you plow through everything you've been talking about more, every page, it's not just that they're image of God, therefore you can do what you want. You have to treat them in a particular way according to the whole of the Torah. I think you've highlighted that very well for us. I also want to introduce, we have another guest. This is how esteemed our colleague here, Dr. Berman, is. Stu Halpern has come all the way down from Yeshiva University, like at 185th Street. He came down just to hear this, right? He works with Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveitchik in the office in the Torah and Western World.
Center for Torah and Western Thought.
Okay, Center for Torah and Western Thought, who's down here with us today. So if you want to say hi to him after we're done here. Okay, so lots of fantastic questions. You've ticked off like 12 boxes. We're going to talk about a lot of this in Hebrew Lit, those of you that are in my class this semester. What questions do you have? Esther, I know you have at least one good question here. Oh, cat in the back. Oh, hold on, let's get the microphone first. We're recording this.
Is that better? Oh, yeah. My question is a little bit about that ancient debt forgiveness you were discussing, because that's a really hot topic today, is can we forgive debt in modern times, especially like student debt or something like that. And then I'm completely aware that economies look very different now than they did then, and even the concept of debt is different. But do you think there's any sort of way we can look it back to that, even though it's not the same community style, it's such a global take on economy anymore? I'm trying to like grasp the whole concept into one, but that is a really interesting thing, but it didn't seem as sustainable, even like ours doesn't seem sustainable then.
Right, it's not clear historically how sustainable it was either. I just want to say that there's always a certain danger in saying, okay, it says in chapter verse here, this is what you should do, and therefore we should do it ourselves as well. I think that we need to adopt a disposition as believers with a high view of Scripture, that when God gives us His word in Scripture, it is not the final word. It is the first word. By that I mean, and I think you can demonstrate this within the Bible itself, within the Hebrew Bible itself, within the Torah itself, that things change over time, and things need to be, certain cardinal rules will have a different manifestation and a different application in different situations. God's word is not permanent and unchanging. And that's not a limitation on God. That's because man changes and because society changes. And this is recognized as something that has to be It has to be addressed. And so therefore, just saying, well, Deuteronomy 15:1 talks about debt cancellation, so therefore we should cancel student loans is a bit of a direct link that I'm not sure we can necessarily do. I'm not saying we shouldn't. There's a discussion here of those that are down and out. So are all students down and out? This is a difficult web of things. Okay? I want to say also that I think, and this I talk about in the book, we live in a culture where there's no word that is holier than the word rights. I have rights. Give me my rights. I'm in favor of rights. But I think what the Torah, it's interesting, the Bible has no word for rights. Here we have this very moral document that seems to be trying to achieve many of the same aims in society and protections for individuals that we are. But there's no word for rights. There's a lot of responsibilities. And I think that what comes out in the Bible is that to demand rights has a place. Are we demanding responsibilities of one another as well? And I'm very concerned about what I see happening in the United States of just incredible splintering and fracturing as a culture, with everyone holding on dearly to their rights, with good reason. But somehow we're going to have to find a way in our communities, certainly in our national structure, to speak about what are the things that bond us, what are the things that we are obligated to one another, alongside the discussion of what are the things that I have coming to me. And this is totally absent today. It leads me, I'm with great fright about what's going to be. Okay? Yeah.
Thank you. Speak to us.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to ask, I guess, our society doesn't really keep the Shabbat or the Shemitah, just like the seventh year. It's for the land. So I wanted to know, are there any examples in our economy that are results of those consequences of not keeping it?
Right.
Because there's benefits in keeping it for like our rest and economically speaking, but
Well, of course, there used to be Sunday blue laws, and that was meant to be something so that all workers would have time off, all workers would have time for their family, without having to fear that someone else was going to take their job. This has gone by the wayside. Maybe it's a good thing, but I think it puts greater pressure on all of us, to work. We're working longer hours, we're working more days a week. This is a concern. In other words, I think what the Torah would say is, okay, if you don't have a Sabbath, if you don't have a sabbatical year, what are you doing to take the ideas that come from those conventions, those commandments? The actual performance of the commandment is not what's important. There's an ideal here. Are you balancing your society in some way so that those are able to come into play as well? And I fear that maybe things have gone a little out of kilter for us in this day and age.
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Annie Ray. I'm a senior here and I study theology. Dr. Johnson has had a great impact on my education over the years. But my question is very similar to the question that was just asked, so you might not even need to worry about answering it again. I wrote a paper once and discovered on my own these verses, saying there's like a whole year needs to be taken off, and then at the 49th year, there's like this year of Jubilee, and so I've always been kind of interested and wondered about that kind of thing, because the only Sabbath we hear about now usually is the day, like the Saturday or Sunday during the week. And so my question was something like, even though it doesn't seem very practical to like take off a whole year, in the Christian community or in the Jewish community, how can we take that principle and do that? And I mean, would you even go so far to say like we should try to figure out a way to take off a whole year? Or moving on from that, like what are the ways that we can do this sort of thing that Yahweh is like indicating to Israel to do that works in our society now?
Can I also suggest that you illustrate how religious Jews in Israel practice this today according to Talmudic tradition?
Or American Jews in Israel.
Or American,
Both
yeah.
for the year.
That was another question that I had too.
Right, yeah, the sabbatical year in Israel, it's a tough thing. The laws are still there. There are some observant Jews in Israel who really let their fields lie fallow for the year. If all Jews did that, we would all starve. And so it doesn't really work out that way, and there's all sorts of like legal loopholes to get us around that. What the modern application of this is challenging for us as observant Jews in Israel. But I think it's challenging, as you mentioned, Annie, in terms of all of us. How do we bring this into our lives? And I would say that the issue here is not necessarily a year or which year, but this idea that there is something that is inviolate and critical for human flourishing where we say we are stopping. We are stopping. I have a right to stop, and it would be best if others stopped as well, because then we're able to enjoy one another and experience one another in that way. And I think that, you know, when employers, especially in, you know, high-powered law offices and like that, it's really, really important if an employee can say, I stop on Sunday, I stop on Saturday, whatever it is. In my experience, employers are respectful of that. And I think all of us have to begin to think, how do we make sure that not every day of the week looks exactly the same? And what are we doing to make sure that we're having quality time with one another and especially with our families? I would say that's the biggest takeaway from this. Mm-hmm.
Sarah, a question up front. You're next, Sarah.
Sorry. Okay. I guess, so one of my questions is a little bit different from sort of some of the other topics we've been talking about today, but in regard to reading, especially narrative portions of the scriptures, I know in a lot of American churches, the sort of emphasis is on, you know, you read this story of David and Goliath, and so David was brave, so you should be brave. Mm-hmm. But I think like, there are a lot of difficult, I mean, Abraham is difficult to read and do that with. I mean, and a lot of other people in the Bible are difficult to read and do that with. So I'm just wondering, what sort of methodology for reading, especially narrative, because it's really easy to read sort of, you know, law, well maybe not easy, but or treatises in the Bible and to understand them philosophically or things like that. But narrative portions of the scriptures, how should people read that and understand what Scripture is trying to do there?
The way in which I like to read biblical narratives is not to make a hagiography out of the figures. Oh, Abraham, he must have been totally saintful and saintly, and David, it doesn't really, you know, he didn't really do something wrong with Bathsheba. No, he really did. I think that there's one hero in the Bible, and that's the Almighty. And what the Bible does is that it shows us many snapshots of individuals dealing with difficult situations, which there are dilemmas as to what to do, and it wants us to kind of experience through them the ins and outs of the types of decisions they had to make. That's what I would say.
I would also just advertise one of our other fellows here. Dr. Shira Weiss has a book called Ethical Ambiguity in the Hebrew Bible. Cambridge University Press. And as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking we need to do one of these with Dr. Weiss because there's lots of things to explore here. Last question is going to go to Sarah.
So you mentioned how the kind of Hebrew political system had structures of equality that were unmatched until America, but a lot of the republics that kind of fell in between the Hebraic Republic and America have a lot more longevity. So do you think like that level of equality in those two systems is kind of utopian, or is it actually possible to have a longevity within a system with that much equality?
Well, I think that you can see, look, the American experiment is already, 2.5 centuries old and flourishing, and the example for the rest of the world. And the Torah's example, although we don't really know the degree to which this was implemented in ancient times, the very fact that the Bible itself has survived all this time means that it was worth enough to enough people to ensure that it would be passed on. So I think that the longevity is there as well. Yeah, that's what I would say. Okay?
I'm actually going to give the last question.
Okay.
Dr. David Innes, who isn't here, couldn't be here, but he wanted me to ask you this question, which I think will be of everybody's interest here, which is, equality comes from the Bible, comes from God, so is anybody who has any belief in any God, says like, okay, God created us all, God's good, has this generic view of an abstract being called God. Is that good enough, or do we need to have this particular God, the God of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? Is it this particular God that ensures the idea of equality is good, or any idea of God will do?
No, it has to be this one, because there were gods in the ancient world, and those gods determined, this guy's at the top of the pyramid, and this guy's going to have a lot of money, and this guy's going to be a slave. So the fact that one has a belief in a deity does nothing to say anything about how the relative view of humans one toward another and the worth of human life will be. So it's I think this is something that comes out, it's a biblical vision of the
This
deity.
God
Yeah.
and this history. This
Yeah.
particular-
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, let us thank very much Dr. Berman.
Thank you.